Now we're live. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the ETC and welcome to the Clean Resource Innovation Network Digital Oil and Gas themed Lunch and Learn today. It's the first time we're doing a Lunch and Learn, so doing something a bit different. My name is Nanette Ho-Covington. I serve as the lead for the Digital Oil and Gas theme and happy to host you at the ETC where I am the executive director. So kind of cool. You get to kill two birds with one stone with that introduction. And I apologize for my cold, so if I sound kind of stuffed up, it's because I am. But before we begin today, I'd like to acknowledge that June is Indigenous History Month, time to reflect, learn, and recognize that each of us has a role to play in advancing understanding, respect, and meaningful change, and the reason why I chose today's topic. So in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, we acknowledge that we gather on the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7 in southern Alberta. This includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, the Kainai and Piikani nations, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Iyer'he Nakoda nations, consisting of the Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Goodstoney. We also recognize that Calgary is home to the Otipemisiwak Métis government of Métis Nation within Alberta, particularly districts 5 and 6. And I apologize again with this cold. My pronunciation isn't as great as it could have been. We honor the original caretakers of this land, known as Mohkinstsis in Blackfoot, and acknowledge all Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples who live, innovate, work, and play here. May this acknowledgement remind us of our shared responsibilities to reconciliation and to building respectful relationships with our Indigenous communities. First, I'd like to call upon Amber Hark, to tell us more about CRIN. Amber is the Director of Member Engagement and Communications, and she'll share a bit more about the great work we're doing.
All right. I think everybody here knows who CRIN is. So for the benefit of those online, but I'll keep it short. And I do have a clicker. Thank you. Lindy will help me. Oh, too far. All right, so CRIN, we are a national, pan-Canadian, federally funded nonprofit that has the honor of managing a $110 million fund from the Strategic Response Fund from ISED with the federal government. And we are in the process of actually extending that agreement with the federal government, and they've been very happy with the work that CRIN has been able to do and the impact that we've had over the last 5 years. And so we are currently in the process of applying for renewed funding, but in the meantime, they've actually extended some additional funds to us that enabled us to have a recent technology competition. But going back to the beginning first is just understanding that the reason CRIN exists is to provide the support for clean technology to be adopted within the oil and gas industry specifically, but a lot of the technologies that we support cross multiple different industries, from mining to cement, aviation, transportation, and agriculture. And so it's been exciting to see the technologies that we've supported be utilized in a variety of different capacities. CRIN is a membership-based organization. We're free to join. There's absolutely zero cost to participate in any of the knowledge sharing that we do, in the different types of events that we do, and in the tools that we provide on our website. And so we actually just surpassed 5,000 members. We just ran a report this week across Canada and globally. We represent 5 different sectors. It used to be 19 that we've condensed into 5, but it essentially makes a seat available at the table for anybody that has anything to do with the energy industry. So we've grouped them into funders, so all forms of funding, adopters, so anybody that's utilizing the technologies being developed, innovators that are coming up with the great technology solutions, support services, which is really anything that can help provide support to those startups and the adoption of the technology, and then talent development, which we recognize is a massive concern within the energy industry and where we're headed, and that we do not have enough people coming into the space. So supporting the industry in that way to help educate and entice youth to look at energy as a future. We also represent 7 technology themes, and these 7 themes were identified by consulting with industry to understand where the greatest challenges were within reducing their emissions. And so they've been identified in that column there. We've adjusted them a little bit over the years to make sure that we are relevant and that we are representing those changing challenges. So we're always looking at those each year and making sure that we're doing the work where we need to be doing it. We have theme leads in each of those. So as Nan mentioned, she is a lead for the digital oil and gas piece. And so we've got fantastic members that volunteer their time to lead discussions and knowledge sharing within these 7 areas. We've currently funded 66 projects. I believe 47 of them are late stage. And we've just announced the funding of 11 new projects with our latest technology competition. At this point, we have leveraged $110 million with that federal funding that I mentioned. And then I'll see if I can get this to go one more time. And so this is just a very small sampling of how CRIN is a network of networks. So this isn't even capturing, of course, our industry partners and the innovator companies. This is showing the different industry associations that we work very closely with, as an example, in some of the different universities. So this just shows that CRIN, we're committed to never compete, never replicate or duplicate, and to really reduce the silos. So finding out what good work is happening across the country and how we can make it accessible and others aware that it exists, so that we are working together and not individually. And so being that pan-Canadian reach enables us to bring different groups together that might be more localized and sharing out the good work that they're doing across the country. We don't compete with anything, we don't sell anything. Our whole purpose of being is to essentially make your lives easier to get the job that you have to get done with support. So of the tools, so in becoming a member, I'll just really quickly mention beyond funding, because we can't provide funding to everybody as much as we would love to. So the additional value that we're able to offer is through the membership portal on our website, is we've got something called an ecosystem map. This is a fantastic data set of information that we did in collaboration with Global Advantage out of Ottawa. And it is organized in a Power BI dashboard, so you no longer have to use a 104-inch map that you print and put on your office wall that's obsolete the next day. You can now access it digitally. If you see data that's missing that you're aware of, there's an opportunity to submit that content so that we can keep it up to date and relevant. And it's very easy to search through that dashboard on the website. The other piece that we've got is something called Innovation Central. This is a tool that's very rudimentary at this point, but we're working in developing that into something much more robust, which will provide the opportunity for innovators, funders, and adopters to find themselves, to help de-risk those technologies so that funders and adopters can see where they've been deployed and what types of support they're looking for. And then the other piece is our membership directory. So when you join CRIN, you agree to be a part of a community where you will share knowledge and you will, as you receive knowledge. And so as a result of that, we have a fantastic network that's never used that member directory for spamming or for sales and things like that. It really is there so that you can find who you're looking for. When you become a member, you identify what sector you are predominantly a part of, what areas of interest you have, so that people can start to look and see what they're looking, find the people that they're looking for. And then the other piece that is on there is, of course, all of the resources and so forth. So when we do events like this, we record everything, we make it accessible across the country, and then we save those webinars and that information onto our YouTube channel that you can access through the website. So you've got that library of resources available to you. So that's CRIN. If you are not a member of CRIN, join us. As I mentioned, it is free, and would be happy to answer any questions that you have afterwards. Enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Amber. It's so cool what we're doing as a community, isn't it? So next I have the distinct pleasure of introducing you to our keynote speaker. So I've had the privilege of serving on the advisory committee for the Alberta Labour Market sponsored study, Shaping a Digital Future for Indigenous Peoples. And I hope the insights that's shared today spark new opportunities within the rapidly growing digital sector. And so joining us today is Sydney Redpath. Sydney is the Director of Communications at the Information and Communications Technology Council, who was employed to do the study. And so ICTC is the other name that it's known by. So Sydney, please come on up.
Alrighty. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. Give me 2 seconds here while I make sure that I got my notes set up. I will say as well that while I'm doing this, Nanette has her cold. I just finished moving to Calgary from British Columbia about 3 days ago. And from where I was moving from, it was still deciding whether or not it wanted to be spring or summer. So I'm still acclimating to the Calgary weather, which is probably also still deciding whether or not it wants to be spring or summer. So I'm a little bit dry in the throat today. If you catch me taking a sip of water, feel free to use that opportunity to ask a question or two. Just going to quickly test this. Perfect. Oops. Oh, I know what I'm doing. There we go. Okay, I wanted to start by saying thank you to the ETC Foundation and to the Clean Resource Innovation Network for being able to host this presentation today. As Nanette mentioned, she was a member of our advisory committee for this research study and provided very, very valuable expertise and insights alongside a number of other folks who participated throughout the couple years of this research initiative that culminated into what I'll be sharing with all of you today. A couple of disclaimers that I feel are important. I'm not Indigenous. ICTC is not an Indigenous organization, but we were very honored to conduct this labor market study and assemble this research in partnership with the First Nations Technology Council. You can see their logo down there, who were very gratefully supported by the province of Alberta and the Government of Canada on the funding of this overall project. So that's ICTC's relationship throughout this overall initiative conducted by the First Nations Technology Council and the province of Alberta. I am also here representing the brilliance of my colleagues who were the ones who actually conducted this research study over the past couple of years. I joined ICTC about 6 or 7 months ago, so I got to join for the easy part of just making it look good, putting it into a report and getting it out into the world. But certain my colleagues who were involved in the project over the last couple of years have such wonderful, rich insights from talking to all of the participants over those years. So the commitment I will make to everyone in the room is that if there is a question that you have that I'm not able to answer, towards the end of the presentation, I put up a QR code to my LinkedIn. Please send me a message with your question, and it's my commitment that I'll make sure to forward that to one of my colleagues and get you an answer, as well as provide anything that you may be interested in for additional information. Just echoing and appreciating that ICTC respectfully acknowledges that Calgary is in the traditional territory of the peoples of Treaty 7 region and in southern Alberta, and that the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation within Alberta. And certainly throughout the full scope and span of this research project that we did across the province, the many Indigenous peoples and the lands that they represented. For those of you who might not be familiar with the Information Communications Technology Council, ICTC is the easier way to say it. We're a politically neutral, not-for-profit national center of expertise with the mission of strengthening Canada's digital advantage in the global economy. And we've been doing that work for over 30 years. We deliver forward-looking research, practical public policy advice, and capacity-building programs for individuals and businesses. And our goal is ultimately to ensure that technology is used to drive economic growth in Canada, and that Canada's workforce, importantly, remains competitive on a global scale. Quick agenda. I've done my best to try to tailor this presentation to not just be a research or a presentation of the research findings, but also pulling out some key findings and differences between that the research observed between Indigenous job seekers versus employers looking to employ and engage Indigenous peoples within their workforce. So I do spend a little bit of time on kind of background and context that is very research based, but again, trying to tailor it to what what I think you all will find very interesting and meaningful when you're thinking about this topic within your workforce. But then I spend a little bit more time on some employer best practices, an employer toolkit specifically that we released alongside this research project, which is very helpful. And there are QR codes accompanied for all of those as well, if you want to give them a deeper dive later on. First QR code is the primary research report. This is also available on our website. It is 80 pages. It is very, very comprehensive, and it is a deep dive read into this topic, as you can imagine. It is also very, very meaningful. To our knowledge, the most comprehensive labor market study to date on Alberta, on Indigenous representation and engagement in Alberta's tech sector. So to us, to the folks that were involved in this project, the meaningful foundation that lays for addressing some of the barriers that we'll talk about today and creating opportunities is really exciting to think about. On the research, I referenced this a couple of times, but to kind of help to paint a little bit more of the picture of the comprehensiveness and why this project took a number of years, it involved over 650 participants across Alberta. To identify those challenges and opportunities for increasing Indigenous representation and engagement in the tech sector. The primary goal in how the research was conducted and the folks that we talked to was to listen to Indigenous voices first and to understand current gaps in training, to explore culturally safe work environments, and to ultimately uncover how Albertan employers and the collective ecosystem of training providers, of associations, can collectively support Indigenous talent and help to create more of those opportunities. And like I said as well, you know, the scale of engagement over those number of years, and ultimately the end product of it is to our knowledge the most comprehensive labor market study to date in Alberta. So that meaningful foundation is encouraging to think about for the future. Very quickly speed through this. If you're interested in the kind of breakdown of those 650 participants, this is the groups of folks that were contained within that big number. We conducted community surveys, we conducted employer surveys. Over 500 employers were engaged across multiple surveys. We conducted interviews with Indigenous community members, interviews with employer and industry leaders, as well as having 2 focus groups in Calgary and Edmonton. So a very kind of diverse true ecosystem perspective when it comes to this topic. We're engaged throughout a lot of the findings that you'll see. Quick definitions here and important clarification when we're talking about Alberta. I'm using the word Indigenous throughout this presentation. Indigenous, as we all know, refers to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in Canada. The findings for this research do primarily reflect First Nations and Métis experiences in Alberta, as Inuit's specific perspectives were very limited due to data pool constraints. I think it's something like 0.1% of Indigenous peoples in Alberta identify as Inuit, so you can imagine it's quite a small data pool that's not enough to be accurately reflected within this overall research. The other thing I'll say, especially as we start to go into kind of the background and context and some of those points that I wanted to pull out for all of you, we recognize as researchers, as authors of this work, that there's bias behind numbers, there's bias behind how those numbers are used and the stories that they can tell. And certainly when it comes to Indigenous people, the systemic gaps in many areas and disciplines of how that third-party data is collected and how it is used exists. And so while it was not within the scope of this research project to help to address some of those gaps, we want to acknowledge it and again just kind of hope that it helps to provide that meaningful foundation to address those gaps in the future. Maps are complicated, certainly, but for folks that haven't maybe seen a map of this before, just to kind of show that like diversity and dispersion of Indigenous territory throughout Alberta, I always really like to put this up in front of folks because it's not often that you kind of get that quick visual snapshot of truly what we're talking about at the diversity and the scale of Indigenous representation in the province. Okay, those quick points of background. We're going to start with the overall digital economy in Alberta, kind of at a glance. Maybe some of this will be new to you in terms of numbers. So Canada's digital economy overall, the national digital economy accounts for over 10% of our national GDP and supports over 2.7 million jobs. Alberta contributes approximately just over 50% of national GDP, despite representing roughly 12% of the national population. But Alberta's digital economy, the rate of growth that it's having and the representation it has within the country is certainly significant. And some of what we noted in terms of the growth rates of Indigenous entrepreneurship are far surpassing the growth rates throughout the rest of the country as well. And of course, 90% of Alberta's tech firms are concentrated here in Calgary and Edmonton, although digital innovation is increasingly extending into rural communities, and we see that for Indigenous engagement in rural communities as well, and some of the job opportunities that have potential for those communities. So an overarching number, again, a national number, Indigenous peoples comprise approximately 5% of Canada's national population, but account for only about 1% of the workforce within the digital economy. So obviously that's a gap, and there's reasons that we observe throughout the research, a three-level digital divide, we call it, that end up helping to explain some of that gap. Here in Alberta, in 2024, the unemployment rate for Indigenous people was just under 12%. That's actually, sorry, that's an error in my presentation here. It should be the unemployment rate overall in Alberta was just under 12%, with Indigenous people facing the highest rate of just over 17% unemployment. This is a good example of systemic gaps in data collection at times. This is obviously a third-party data point. When we were doing a presentation of this research I believe it was in Edmonton a number of months ago, a community member kind of put up their hand and said, well, based off of the communities that I know and I work with, I actually know that, the unemployment figure is much, much higher than that. And we had a conversation about, how is data collected from those communities? Is data collected from those communities? Well, it probably isn't. So that's kind of an example there where take some of those figures with a big grain of salt. And then on reserve, First Nations individuals have an employment rate of about 40%, which is just under 35 percentage points below non-Indigenous Albertans. So the three-level digital divide that we observe through our research that helps to not fully explain, but attempt to explain some of that gap is about 1, access, 2, skills, and 3, equality of outcome. And this will be echoed kind of throughout the rest of the presentation as well. So first, on access, 80% of Indigenous communities lack reliable high-speed internet meeting federal standards. Rural installation fees are just about 50% higher than urban rates, and it costs a lot more monthly. So access is inherently a barrier when it comes to not just infrastructure, but to be able to access that infrastructure. 2, skills. There's about a 13 percentage point gap in digital literacy confidence between Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth. We saw this throughout our research as well. Even though technically some survey respondents possessed those digital skills, they didn't have enough. They didn't have the confidence to say that they did. So confidence is a factor in addition to whether or not they actually have had opportunities to develop those skills. And then equality of outcome is kind of the third level of that digital divide. Access and those skills gaps translate into unequal economic outcomes, ultimately limiting Indigenous people's ability to convert digital tools into employment and education opportunities. So as we kind of go into some of the primary, some of the interesting findings that I think will be interesting for this room on differences we found between surveying employers versus surveying job seekers. I think some of those points of context and background are just very kind of helpful. So the first one being, and I pull out kind of top barriers and then I go into top opportunities. And then when we get into the employer best practices, we start to share a little bit more from the toolkit that helps to address some of these differences that we heard from during the research study. So the first kind of top barrier cited by job seekers that were surveyed was in training. Thankfully, I think that this is big enough for folks in the room, but I'll do my best for folks that may be tuning in virtually. The top barriers to folks being able to access technology-related training. Number one was financial. So about 50% of survey respondents cited that as their number one barrier. Lack of awareness and lack of local options, which you can think about, survey respondents that were coming from rural and remote backgrounds. That lack of local options is particularly acute. But also on here too, we have other top results, so lack of support for returning learners or mature students. You'll see kind of a bit more context on that throughout the presentation. Cost of relocation, living expenses, limited access to mentors or role models in the field. Pretty much all of that top there were cited more or less equally as very prominent barriers that job seekers faced when they're looking to access technology-related training and to develop those skills. And again, you can layer on top the context of folks that are coming from rural and remote communities and just, imagine a multiplier effect on what they have available to them and the barriers that they might perceive. Recruitment. This is, I kind of want to call it my favorite slide because I found it to be the most interesting, particularly as a communications professional. This was a survey of employers on their recruitment and advertising strategies, how they look for roles, how they post roles. And ultimately we found that employers overwhelmingly rely on LinkedIn. It's kind of the standard or so. And Indeed, so 56%, 44% of respondents, so those were their top two outlets for trying to recruit. While Indigenous job seekers primarily found opportunities through Facebook and word-of-mouth community networks. When we get into employer best practices and the toolkit that also resulted from this project, there's some specific resources of Indigenous-led job boards and employment-focused organizations that help to address some of these gaps. But from an employer perspective, I found this one to be the most interesting because it really kind of disrupts that assumption on where Indigenous job seekers are naturally going to find opportunities. A bit more on recruitment continued. Some other things that we noted in interviewing job seekers and employers is that an over-reliance on automated screening tools tends to disadvantage Indigenous applicants whose career paths getting to that point may have been non-traditional or whose communication styles differ from quote-unquote like standard corporate norms. That is pacing of language, that is eye contact, that is physical contact. Those cultural norms, no matter what culture you're talking about, are always going to be different. But for maybe kind of what you would think about as a standard corporate norm here in Canada, those differences and how automated screening tools don't account for those differences is a barrier in recruitment for Indigenous job seekers. And then misconceptions, assumptions exist about where Indigenous talent is located. While it may be often assumed to be concentrated rurally, urban Indigenous populations are growing quite rapidly. Top barriers for self-selection and perception. So this is kind of coming from a job seeker perspective or young Indigenous people that are thinking about their career opportunities. Obviously, the legacy of colonialism and ongoing systemic inequities can internalize into self-doubt and a tendency to self-select into lower paying roles, even when their capability or their skill sets do exist for more advanced positions. This isn't something that is necessarily reflected into the research presentation, but we heard comments on is that the positive branding of being in tech as a meritocracy-based system can actually be really intimidating to an Indigenous learner or a job seeker who may have some of those gaps in education or may come from a rural or remote community. A meritocracy-based system, in principle, if you go to a fancy post-secondary school or a not so fancy post-secondary school, or depending on your privilege of background, a meritocracy would mean that you would get, more or less equality of opportunity. But you can think about, again, that kind of confidence and that perception and that self-selection, that meritocracy kind of label that the tech sector can really kind of positively promote at times can actually be a little bit intimidating to folks and have the opposite effect. As well, being the first in one's family to graduate high school or to attend post-secondary education adds significant pressure in interviews and professional settings. You can imagine folks are very nervous when they have that weight on their shoulders. And then, again, my kind of point here on the tech sector being meritocracy-based can be intimidating. But in terms of talent and readiness, what we found throughout the research is that Indigenous youth already possess very strong foundational digital skills, as with young people more generally, right? And a growing interest in technology fields including AI, cybersecurity, data analytics, coding, entrepreneurship. We found that 70% of Indigenous job seekers that we surveyed described themselves as being somewhat or fully prepared for tech roles, which is very significant and encouraging. And also too that Indigenous job seekers identified, community-oriented motivations for pursuing technology careers. They wanted the ability to be able to work hybrid, work remote, be able to, stay or remain attached to their communities, to be able to support their families, and the potential for technology to amplify Indigenous voices and storytelling, and the potential for Indigenous entrepreneurship within the tech space as well, is something that was very exciting to a lot of survey respondents. And again, led to their high degree of interest in those types of roles. Complementary to those last couple points there is really meaningful alignment between employer demand and the skills that Indigenous talent classify themselves as being somewhat or fully prepared to meet for employers, particularly in those areas of data analysis and IT support. So, for example, employers identify IT support, cybersecurity, and network administration as the top 3 areas of immediate hiring need, whereas Indigenous job seekers mostly reported skills in, complementary to those positions, data analysis, business analysis, and computer hardware and troubleshooting. So there's a high skills and demand alignment for employers to go out to Indigenous job seekers within those areas. But again, bringing in some of those important points of context and background, approximately just over 20% of the job seeker survey respondents that we talked to selected none of the listed skills, underscoring that uneven access to training and digital exposure remains a real gap. Oops. So on to employer best practices. This is the second QR code for all of you. This is also available on our website. If you go and you find the research report, it is linked on that very same page. Sorry to change that if somebody was trying to scan it. This is truly an employer toolkit. It is to the point. It lists many Indigenous-led job boards, Indigenous-led training, cultural awareness opportunities, really great resources in terms of developing an inclusion strategy. It is to the point. If you're looking for a good resource to share with your staff on things and practices that you can meaningfully start to incorporate. On those best practices, the ones that I wanted to pull out for you in this presentation from the toolkit One of the important ones was Indigenous inclusion versus DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Recognizing that Indigenous peoples are rights holders in Canada, effective inclusion strategies is a best practice that they be developed separately from broader DEI frameworks, and importantly must be Indigenous-led. It's certainly been like a trend that I've noticed in organizations that I've worked with over the years, that DEIR is becoming the term and kind of an overarching policy on how organizations are approaching those policies. So diversity, equity, inclusion, and reconciliation. But again, separating those out, recognizing the rights that they hold, and making sure that those policies are Indigenous-led. Is recommended as a best practice across employers that we talk to that are doing this work very, very effectively and meaningfully, and ultimately what job seekers are looking for in terms of inclusion as well. Oh. Okay. This thing aggressively vibrates and buzzes at me if I don't point it the right direction, and it always startles me. So another area of best practices are addressing those real considerations, like those points of background and context, to show that employers really understand the real and unique considerations of Indigenous peoples. Research participants, I think that this was across both employers that were doing this work very meaningfully, as well as job seekers, were very explicit that it is unrealistic to promote digital career pathways without first ensuring that those considerations are met. Obviously, that kind of being able to address those barriers ties into what society at large can do, what our public institutions can do. It's a shared responsibility that we all have for addressing some of those barriers. But I wanted to pull out ones that were a little bit more applicable to employers. So the confidence, the perception of the tech sector being meritocracy based, and that may be having kind of the opposite effect as intended. What that does to job seekers who self-select themselves out of those opportunities, how you can help to kind of address and create that environment where they don't feel like they need to do that. Remote and hybrid environments were cited as a very important inclusion principle for the still 30 to 40% of Indigenous peoples in Alberta that do still live in rural communities, do still live in their home communities as well as providing clear pathways from traditional sectors into digital roles. I may have sped past the bullet point earlier on the slide, or maybe it was something that I ended up removing. But one of the other kind of good points of context and background is that in a lot of these rural and remote communities, there's kind of an expectation of what your career pathway is going to be based off of what your family's done, based off of what your peers have done, what your educators or the training institutions that may or may not be available to you, the pathways that they have set out for you that are linear when you're coming out of high school. Men tend to get funneled into construction, into resource roles, into trades. Women tend to get funneled into administrative roles, social work, teaching, for example. So in terms of being able to make those pathways available, make them linear to follow, and be able to provide those within folks' communities when they're coming out of high school and looking to get into post-secondary education. It can't be an assumption that they'll just find it, is essentially the point that I'm making there. Another area, best practices in terms of investing in digital infrastructure. Again, this is one that isn't necessarily like an employer responsibility, but is important to think about. Obviously, that first level of the 3-layer digital divide, being access, reliable high-speed internet, up-to-date devices, quiet workspaces, consistent tech support are really fundamental prerequisites for participation in the digital economy. Imagine everyone here works a laptop job. We all get very unimpressed when our laptops don't work or our tools don't work. You can imagine when you're in a community that doesn't have reliable internet access, you don't have an up-to-date device, you're not provided with a quiet workspace if you are going in on a hybrid environment, you don't have consistent tech support, like all of the things that we get really frustrated with living and working where we do, that is highly connected. You can imagine that as a daily point of frustration and a barrier for folks that are trying to get into and advance their careers in this space. And then awareness building and program delivery must be taken directly to rural and remote communities rather than relying on urban-based or internet-dependent models that don't quite engage people in the same way and certainly don't give them the same networking opportunities. If you think about, the financial barriers in accessing training, personal anecdote, how 10, 12, whatever years ago when I was first entering the workforce and, I was with an employer and they wanted to send me away for training. I was coming out of post-secondary school, a reimbursement-based expense policy, asking a young person in general, maybe from the community that they come from, to carry, potentially $1,000 to $2,000 worth of cost and then be reimbursed a month or so later. That is a barrier to some people. So you can think about, again, the value of being able to have that training brought to people's communities and addressing one of those financial barriers. Another area, best practices. And again, this is a big section within the employer toolkit that lists a lot of resources. Culturally relevant, Indigenous-led training. Training was cited by employers, job seekers that were surveyed throughout this research study, was the most effective when it was co-designed with Indigenous organizations and community members rather than developed externally and delivered to communities. That feels very intuitive probably for most folks, but if you're looking for Indigenous-led training resources that were cited throughout multiple respondents to the survey, they're available in the employer toolkit that I put the QR code up for. I think I'm almost done here and also getting a little bit close on time. This is kind of a quote here to demonstrate this from one of the employers that we interviewed that does this work quite well and quite meaningfully. And I'll read it out to folks online. So we had 12 students who completed 10 weeks of training and all 12 finished. They had living allowance, they had transportation support, wraparound services, they felt comfortable and ready to start work immediately. So this quote is very illustrative because it is grounded in a concrete, measurable outcome of what investing in those types of wraparound supports and addressing those barriers can lead to, which is a 100% completion rate of training programs. Best practices for what do I mean by those wraparound supports? So things like career counseling, things like mentorship, things like networking opportunities with Indigenous employers and role models were identified by 90% of community survey respondents that we talked to. Transportation assistance was another big one. Having access to culturally relevant or Indigenous-led employment programs and funding for training costs. Wraparound supports also mean things like living allowances or stipends during training. They're identified as like the single most decisive factor in even enabling participation and being able to complete programs. And then additional priorities, things like childcare support, on-reserve technology training delivery, access to elder guidance, paid internships. It's a really like broad definition of wraparound supports. You can just think about it as like what helps to make people successful when they're participating in these programs, being able to support their success in completing these programs, considering all of the factors of people's lives and the supports that they may or may not have available to them in their home communities, and how employers can help to be able to support that, again, for the interest of being able to support participation and completion of those types of programs. Recruitment, I previewed this a little bit. So best practices, the difference that was noted between employers and job seekers, it feels maybe a little bit straightforward, like broadening your recruitment practices, not necessarily moving entirely away from LinkedIn and Indeed because they do have such great reach, but considering how you can reach people kind of where they are. So Facebook, community word of mouth networks, and trusted figures within the community, same way as we all network opportunities to each other all the time when we see them, how you can develop relationships within communities to help to share those opportunities through folks' personal networks. And then interviewers being aware of cultural differences and communication styles, some of those automated screening tools, and you know the differences and the nuances that they don't account for. Individual achievement-focused interview questioning might not resonate with Indigenous candidates whose contributions are oriented towards, you know, wonderful things that they've done within their community, or things that they've done, you know, as a collective. Hiring committees should be trained to recognize and value that type of distinction. And then practical adjustments, you know, including oral and interactive evaluations, having Indigenous mentor support during recruitment, and just, again, thinking about how you can kind of address and provide inclusion in some of those tactics. How am I doing for time? I have 10 minutes? I'm still good? Okay, perfect. I'm like 5 slides away. And the last 3 are just inviting people to connect. So I'll wrap up pretty quick here. So for culturally safe workspaces, there we go. So cultural safety, what we mean by that is when Indigenous employees experience their workplace as one that acknowledges, you know, the effects of colonization, that respects their cultural identity, and that actively, I should have underlined actively, includes Indigenous knowledge and perspectives. So some practical steps can include, you know, mandatory Indigenous cultural awareness training for all staff, including executives, as part of, you know, setting that example. Designated spaces, if you have the availability of it for cultural practices, you know, such as smudging rooms, for example. Paid spiritual days, and then culturally inclusive benefits. Oh, maybe. Oh, there we go. Perfect. And then remote and flexible work. I won't spend too much time on this because I feel like I talked about it enough, but again, expanding, you know, remote and flexible work options is one of the most practical and impactful steps for supporting Indigenous participation. And again, reducing the expectation that Indigenous peoples must leave their communities in order to pursue these types of roles. And then in terms of, you know, active and meaningful support, Indigenous workers tend to be over-mentored and under-sponsored, I think is a good way to kind of summarize this. So sponsorship versus mentorship. So sponsorship is active advocacy by a well-placed decision maker, like actively putting somebody up for opportunities, including them in things, versus, you know, a mentor relationship where you have, you know, side kind of coaching conversations with someone and they're not necessarily meaningfully involved in those types of opportunities or proactively involved in those types of opportunities. So sponsorship is a good way to think about an evolution of mentorship that's really, really meaningful to Indigenous workers. Cohort-based onboarding, again, helps to build like those networking opportunities. It provides ease of integration into teams, provides, structure to informal conversations, helping people feel connected and prepared. And then having visible Indigenous role models without tokenism, again, well-placed decision makers that have a sponsorship relationship within organizations help to normalize Indigenous presence within their sector and signal to Indigenous youth that those careers are very genuinely within reach. So in terms of a summary, this is my kind of personal hazard at 4 things that I think can be quite immediate for employers to start to think about. The first one is that if you don't already know and recognize this, Indigenous participation in Alberta's tech sector faces real gaps, but also very real growth and value. The rate of Indigenous entrepreneurship within the tech sector outpaces the country and is particularly impressive here in Alberta. Targeted recruitment and engagement of Indigenous peoples should be treated as separate and distinct from DEI policies. See the employer toolkit if you're interested in resources for how you can meaningfully think about that. Revisit assumptions, like identify those assumptions, revisit them about the attractiveness and the linear paths into the tech sector, like meet people where they are, make those paths really clear, think about some of the assumptions that you have on what folks need to be able to participate and complete those types of training opportunities, and then wraparound supports. I would put like a double underline under wraparound supports. Are really, really effective, not just for Indigenous job seekers, but really for most folks that are hoping to succeed in those types of investments that you make in training programs. If there's any questions that folks have, or if you have to jet off right away, that's a QR code to my LinkedIn. Please send me a message. Again, if I'm not able to answer it for you, I will very happily follow up with my colleagues who did actually conduct this research over the past couple of years. And if there's anything that you're interested in receiving a copy of, I'm happy to do that as well. And then that's everything. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Happy to answer any questions folks have as we're mingling about afterwards.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sydney. And thank you for those online. Does anybody have any questions? Because I can run around with the mic. Mark always has a question.
I'll do my best.
Thank you. We just finished hiring 2 Indigenous people, and we trained to be drone pilots. And we got some funding through CAE through a military contract called ITB funding. And it worked really, really well. Actually, they're flying great and they love their jobs, kind of thing. Is there anything like that? We want to expand it. It's been so successful. We want to take it to the community, like to where the First Nations communities are. Is there any programs you know in place that would be able to help us fund that type of idea?
To fund that type of idea?
Yeah.
Would you be open to organizations that can help to deliver it within communities alongside you potentially?
Alongside us, yes. Like we'd be the primary, most likely, on doing it.
Okay.
Because we already done it once, and we just want to grow it farther.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, I'm going to note down your question, and if not within the employer toolkit, I'll follow up with my colleagues who may have encountered those types of resources. If not officially within the research, I can share some with you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Anybody else with a question? Oh, sorry. Here we go, Kelly.
So sorry, I feel like I had my back turned on the folks over here the whole time.
Taking notes, so I needed the table. So thanks for the presentation. I had a question when I was looking at the particular barriers about obviously AI in disrupting a lot of those barriers in terms of tech meritocracy and access. So I'm curious about sort of the next steps on this research and incorporating or looking at AI going forward.
So speaking on behalf of ICTC, we would love to find like a home to be able to do like a deeper dive into aspects of this research, or even be able to do this research nationally as well. We don't quite have a funding home for that yet, but if anyone knows of any, please come and talk to me, because we would love to do that exact kind of deep dive that you mentioned on like how Indigenous workers are feeling about AI and all of the aspects that would be included within that, even from like an entrepreneurship angle, the opportunities that that creates, which I think in Alberta are already having some really great case studies. Thank you for the question.
Yeah. So Kelly, I've shared the report with the Minister of Indigenous Affairs for Alberta, and I've also shared it with the Minister of AI at federal level. So I'm doing my best as being part of the advisory committee and spreading the word about this report and the additional work that could be done with it. Any other questions, anyone? All right, well, that's a wrap. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Corinne.
Thank you so much.
And if you want to watch this or rewatch this, it is available or going to be available online, so you can share it with other folks.